I'm David Arnold from the University of Warwick, and I'm here to chair the second session of this global conversation about global history, or perhaps global histories. I would like to add my appreciation to other people who've spoken in favour and indeed in support of Maxine's enormously heroic and important efforts on behalf of global history. I think we all recognise the importance of this gathering and the deliberations which come out of it. So this afternoon's session is entitled Approaches, Methods and Methodologies in Global History, and our first speaker is Sanjay Subrahmanyam from the Department of History at UCL. I'm not going to attempt to run through Sanjay's multitudinous publications. I'm sure you're all aware of the richness of his work, extending very widely across the history of South Asia, the Indian Ocean, and all the areas associated with it. So without more ado, I'll hand you over to Sanjay, who is talking about global history and connectedness, connectedness being one of the themes which I think has been a very important part of his own intellectual and methodological contribution to global history. Sanjay.
When I first received my invitation to this conference, I thought that this looked like a conference about epistemology, about how one produces knowledge and reflections on knowledge making. And since now having the office next door to Perry Anderson's, I've become convinced that his views on the existence of something called national character are perfectly justified. It struck me that the British, who are noted for their sense of humor, must have been displaying it when they decided to have a conference on epistemology without a single epistemologist. I then discovered there was a mistake. There is one epistemologist, at least in this audience, but he's no longer a card-carrying member. He doesn't pay his dues anymore. So it struck me that what we were then going to do is pretty much talk about ducks and drakes and little examples about this and that. Once in a while, somebody might mention Gadamer, but it might be by mistake mostly. And Kozelek is certainly not going to feature in this conversation. So we're going to talk about how history gets written, but without engaging the epistemologists, and certainly not engaging those people who write about history writing as a philosophical problem and a historical philosophical problem. Instead, we're going to try and do it apparently by adding one example to another. Now, I have to say that faced with this rather difficult prospect of spending 2 days actually talking around the subject without properly addressing it, it struck me that it might be necessary actually to try and do something, even if in a rather amateurish fashion, reflecting back on what exactly it is we try to do when we do something called global history and how have other people done it in the past. I certainly am not one of those who believes that it was invented 10 years ago or 5 years ago or day before yesterday. I think this has been going on for quite a long time. And I think we need to reflect on how it's been going on for quite a long time. What are the methods and the methodologies that were used in the past? And so I'm going to bring to the table a certain number of questions which have not been brought so far and probably will not be brought up again, but I want to actually place them on the table. Some years ago, I wrote an article which I think was entitled Connected Histories, or something of that kind. And for a day or two, I had the illusion that I'd actually said something terribly original. Then reflecting on it, I realized that I hadn't. Actually, this had been going on for quite a long time. And I realized that without knowing it, one of the things that actually had sunk into my subconscious was the influence of someone who was not my teacher, but Wong Wu-bin's teacher, which is to say Joseph Fletcher. A very important historian of Inner Asia and China, who had actually written a series of articles, which I think used to be called Joe Fletcher's Plane Ride, I think it used to be called, yeah. You can see that frequent flyer miles are one of the things that tie him and Ben Wong together. But what we're seeing is in Fletcher's work a kind of notion of what he called integrated histories. So his idea was this, that historians of China normally do not talk to historians of Islamic Central Asia, do not talk to historians of Iran, do not actually address the subjects which bring them all together. And that these subjects finally have an enormous importance for the history of China time and again, not merely at the time of the Yuan dynasty or of the Qing, but in fact are an ongoing problem in the history of China, which is set aside and occasionally features in one or the other chapter of a Cambridge history of China, such as the one that Fletcher himself wrote, but are not taken sufficiently seriously. And indeed, going back before Fletcher, there are other people who reflected in a similar vein, sometimes in writing, sometimes orally. The Princeton historian Martin Dixon was someone who was actually quite close methodologically to many of the things that Fletcher did, though he wrote very little of it. And in a different vein, a historian with whom I had very close relations, namely the great French historian Jean Aubin, was someone who also practiced something which was not dissimilar in a certain way, though with a very different angle to it, to this kind of integrated histories or connected histories, which involved actually marrying fields which conventionally, for no particularly good reason other than nationalism and the parochial peculiarities of the training of historians, are kept separate. Now, of course, I realized once I began to reflect further on this, that this was not even just something which had begun in the 20th century. In fact, this is a series of reflections that goes back quite considerably in time. And I eventually began to think back on much earlier examples of people who wrote global histories of one kind or the other. And this took me certainly quite easily back to the 16th century, and perhaps even beyond it. But certainly in the 16th century, you can find various world historians or global historians who refer to the fact, for example, at least 3 or 4 Portuguese historians of the time refer to this thing which they call a redondeza, which is to say the globe, as something which is an object upon which they are reflecting. And these are people who do so in very different modes. So I want to give you a series of examples of people who actually approach the problem of writing history on a global scale, starting in the 16th and 17th century. And I want to make an argument that what distinguishes them from us is certainly one thing, which is that they were not writing in a mode which was influenced by something called the social sciences. But at another level, there are actually quite important continuities between what they were doing and what we are doing. And these are continuities which we tend to obscure, and we tend to obscure them at our own cost, and we pay a considerable price, in my opinion, for obscuring them. So who are the kinds of people I'm thinking about in the 16th or the 17th century? What are they doing, and why are they doing it? Some of the people I'm talking about are people who are actually arguing that they can write histories or reflections on a world scale on an experiential basis. So this takes us back somewhat to Linda Colley's reflections in the morning, but I'm thinking, for example, of someone whom a certain number of people in this audience know well, the very peculiar Englishman by the name of Anthony Shirley, who wrote a modestly titled book called Peso Político de todo el mundo, the political balance of the whole world, because he claimed to have political experiences that were sufficiently large that he could reflect on the basis of direct experience on very large parts of the world. And he was actually quite right at a certain level. This is someone who knew Iran, the Ottoman Empire directly, knew a certain amount about the Russia of Boris Godunov, Poland, Germany. He had been with Rudolf II in Prague. He had been to the New World. He had been an ambassador to the Sultan of Morocco. He wound up his life in Granada and reflected on the world as he saw it, based not on textual knowledge, but on what he thought of as a kind of an experiential knowledge, which allowed him to speak about what he called, actually, and it's a very interesting expression, what he called la máquina del mundo. The world is a machine, and a machine where the bits and pieces fit together, and where he's actually taking ideas which probably come to him from Guicciardini through Francis Bacon, notions of political balance, but also of, as I said, the world as a kind of a mechanical construct at a certain level. So you get people like this who are actually reflecting on the world and writing a kind of a global history which is based upon some notion that their experience in some way authorizes them to write this history. So it's not we who are writing the history of the world because for some reason we can constitute an archive based upon their experiences, but they themselves who actually, by the very process of participating in something which takes them to different parts of the globe, consider themselves, in some sense, capable of reflecting on this as an object and constructing it. Now, this is, of course, a case of someone who reflects and who writes while also being a person of action. He, of course, is also a very notorious sort of forger of documents, a crook of some kind. He's an Oxford graduate. This is not entirely a coincidence. But what we actually have is someone who's capable then of both acting upon the world and reflecting upon it. But there were many others who actually were writing world histories in the 16th and 17th century on a quite different basis. And this is what I actually want to spend a little bit of time on, which is what is the other mode in which global histories were written and have been written for a very, very long time. Now, we know that if we look at the world histories or the global histories that are written today, they are often based, in the first instance, on extremely materialistic premises. And they're often based upon ideas, for example, the simplest way of doing a kind of a world history or a global history is to do it with numbers, is to actually be able to produce numbers in the sort of Angus Madison mode, if you like, for the GDPs of different parts of the world. And in fact, the nice thing about doing that is that you entirely avoid the problem of culture, you entirely avoid the problem of any kind of local erudition. What you can actually have is an archive which is constituted, which is produced, and which is made up of things which are perfectly comparable to one another. This is, of course, the heritage of Kuznets and the modern economic growth kind of school of economic history. And of course, the nice thing about, for instance, writing about GDP in the 16th century is you can even make most of the numbers up. So in fact, that makes life even simpler. Now, this is the mode with which we are familiar. But there is another mode which is, I think, a much more common and a much more important mode. When we go back and think about the people who were writing these histories in the 16th and 17th centuries, we see that they're doing this in quite a different manner. And I want to start with one example, and I'm going to multiply them, maybe go to 3 or 4. You will actually have to keep time for me, I'm sorry. So let's look to a well-known figure that the Ottomanists in the audience would know, a man by the name of Katib Çelebi, or Haji Khalifa. Writing a series of texts for an Ottoman audience in the 17th century. Someone who actually has increasingly attracted the attention of European intellectual historians. I see that Nicolas Dew, in his recent book on French Orientalism in the world in the period of Louis XIV, actually looks at the reception of Haji Khalifa's work in France in the 17th century, and how this work is actually, some of it is actually then translated or reappropriated. I say reappropriated because actually the interesting thing about Katib Çelebi is that this is someone who has access to Italian and Latin materials, who is reading Paolo Giovio, who is actually reading Jesuit materials, who is actually the first Ottoman historian, to my knowledge, who produces an account of Japan at the time of the Tokugawas, right? Who's actually producing a kind of a world history based upon the appropriation of quote-unquote Islamic knowledge in Arabic and Turkish and so on, which is an older Ottoman tradition, but who's also actually drawing on European materials and incorporating this into his world history, his famous text by the name of Cihan Numa, which he produces, and which is one of the early Ottoman texts, I believe, which entered into print in that brief Ottoman flirtation with print in the 1720s. Now, how is this man working, and how do we actually understand his methods? This is not someone who is arguing as an eyewitness. This is not the Shirley way of actually approaching the world. This is a quite different way of approaching the world. And it's a way of approaching the world which has something to do with other people, though not in the same tradition. It has something to do, for example, with a figure like Joseph Scaliger, on whom, as many of you would know, Anthony Grafton devoted a very large proportion of his early working life. But actually, he very late in the book on Scaliger, he suddenly came to the realization that not only was he concerned with producing a history and a chronology which comprehended the peoples of the Bible, but that Scaliger was actually terribly disturbed by the fact that in the 16th century, you had to understand what was happening with the Mayas, or what was happening with the Aztecs, or with the Chinese, who operated in knowledge systems which were not the knowledge systems that he knew. So this brings me to my main and principal point, which is that I think that we ignore at our cost that the first world histories and what remain in some sense at the heart of a problem of a certain kind of world history is the problem of philology. Right? I think that we have to place the problem of philology squarely on the table. This is really the core problem of the method. Because to tell you the truth, to write a world history based on World Bank statistics, which the World Bank has already produced for you, is trivial. Anybody can do this, right? Or to write a world history because you got access to the archives of the Ford Foundation and the Ford Foundation medal in most countries in the world is not a very fun thing to do, to tell you the truth. The real stuff, the really difficult stuff is actually to do this when you are trying to render commensurable different histories, which are written in different intellectual traditions. The whole problem which we're actually concerned with, I think the interesting part of the problem we're concerned with, and historians of science will recognize this, is to not look at the problem of commensurability or incommensurability as a problem of states of nature, but as a problem of produced commensurabilities. So how do people produce commensurability? There's no single answer to this. And I'm going to argue, and this is my fundamental point, that actually philology is the fundamental route that people took to produce commensurability, and therefore, in order to introduce different histories into a single history of a global variety. So what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about people like Scaliger then approaching matters precisely through a philological perspective. You get the lunatic fringe of this, of course. You get Guillaume Postel, right? But who's still operating fundamentally from what he fondly imagines is a philological perspective. Now, people like George Huppert, writing about the idea of perfect history in 16th century France, regarded most of this as nonsense and thought that the idea of perfect history should be reduced to incredibly small objects contained within single cultures. Whereas I think that the interesting thing is actually to look at how, for better or for worse, in a more or less convincing manner, you actually get people trying to produce this kind of knowledge. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that the practice of philology does not belong to a single cultural tradition. It does not belong to a single continent. It does not belong to a single polity. If one starts looking around for what people are doing creatively with philology for this period, the 16th and the 17th centuries, we know from the work, for instance, of Benjamin Ellman, that in some sense, philology is key to a whole set of intellectual changes which are taking place in Ming and especially in Qing China. Right? In fact, it has been rightly said, both for Europe and possibly for China at some level, the work of Ellman, for instance, being confirmed by the work of Chinese intellectual historians like Wang Hui, that philology was in some sense the queen of the sciences at this time, and it was actually the key to a whole series of productions of knowledge. If I turn to India, for example, the work of Sheldon Pollock, but also of Velcheru Narayan Rao and others, shows that whether you're within the domain of Sanskrit or whether you're in the domain of the Indian vernaculars, you're actually constantly facing up to this problem of philology rendering comprehensible and producing the possibility of commensurability and translation. That is fundamentally how historians work when they want to get out of a narrow tradition. If you look to the great Mughal chronicler of the late 16th century, Abul Fazl, how does he function? How actually does he produce this history which takes him to the Mongols on the one hand and to the Mamluks on the other? How does he do it? The technique is essentially philological. Right? You actually stabilize a textual corpus. You try and work with it in terms of actually making judgments concerning the relative worth of different manuscript traditions. You actually attempt to then produce a corpus with which you can work, and then eventually you try and synthesize this corpus. This, to my mind, was the fundamental mode by which global history was long dealt with. And to my mind, it is still the subterranean tradition. It is still, in some sense, the important tradition where, to my mind, much of the best global history is still written. It is still written, when I say that, I mean at a monographic level, not at the level of, Bill McNeill reading 6 books and producing the 7th. Right? I'm talking about people actually going out and saying things which are not just surprising to themselves, or not just surprising to the area to which they consider themselves to be primary specialists, but things which are actually surprising to people who are working in areas where they scratch their heads and say, well, we never saw that. Right? Now, how is that kind of monographic world history actually produced? And I believe that it is fundamentally produced in large measure, I'm not saying exclusively, but in very large measure by, in some sense, drawing upon this deep and very complex philological tradition, which was once multifarious, which has now become somewhat more uniform, but is still not perfectly uniform. Because if those of you who, for example, have worked with Sanskrit Pandits will know that their philological techniques, even today, are quite distinct from those practiced in the West. For example, the relationship between history and memory, the relationship between oral transmission and actually textual transmission is seen quite differently in Sanskrit knowledge making. So what we have here then is something which, to my mind, has been somewhat set aside, but which still is out there as a problem. And I just want to give you one little example of someone who actually has been trying to struggle with this, and I've been watching him quite closely, and I find it very interesting. Jeffrey Parker, who is a friend of many people sitting over here, has been working for a long time on this book on the world crisis in the 17th century. Now, what Parker wanted to do working on the world crisis in the 17th century was not simply to limit himself to the dozen or so European languages that he works with, but actually to say something interesting about China, to say something interesting about the Ottoman Empire, areas where he doesn't control the primary material. So what he actually has tried to do is to use this very complicated relationship, this sort of combination of carrot and stick, which we call research assistants, and try to persuade people to actually work with him in some sense to render these things available to him, to actually produce that kind of commensurability, to actually give him access to texts which he would not normally have access to. I have no idea whether this is going to be a successful exercise or not. I haven't seen the end product. The only chapters he's shown me are the India ones. Right? I don't know what the rest of it looks like. But I have to say that this is an interesting exercise over here, which in some sense is a, shall we say, hierarchical form of collaboration, but is a form of collaboration which is reminiscent in some ways of the way in which, let's say, some of the early East India Company officials worked with their pundits. Now, what we're left with is, therefore, I think, finally, the harder tradition and the easier tradition of doing global history. I believe that this corresponds in some way to the fact that, for example, in American history departments, you have some which wind up being located in the humanities schools and some which wind up being located in the social sciences schools, which shows you actually this peculiar identity crisis that history itself has. I think we tend to focus too much on the social scientific when we look at global history. And I think that this prejudice is evident both in the formulation of this conference and indeed in the list of invitees. Having been trained myself in the social sciences, I actually would make a plea to a return to the humanistic end of it. And I believe that the humanistic end of it requires us to take seriously the kind of problem of philology that I'm talking about. That brings me to my last point. Can we train students then to be global historians? And I think that where we realize that we can't train them easily is precisely because of the fact that we can train them in philological techniques, but the concrete part of what actually philology requires of us in order to write something like a global history is enormously difficult. You cannot, even within the 6 or 7 or 8 years of an American PhD program, which God knows are twice as generous as those in this country in terms of the time that they give. Even in that time, it is actually impossible virtually to train somebody to work with, let's say, Qing documents and the archive of the Simancas, and also to read Nahuatl or Quechua. Right? To be able to actually do these things were the kinds of things that perhaps insane people like Postel and Kircher might have thought they were able to do in the 16th or the 17th century, but we are perhaps saner or at least less ambitious. So we can see here that this is not a simple set of propositions that we have. And I think that what we have from the past is a sense in which why these are difficult. It also tells us why global history, beyond parochialism, why global history has so few practitioners at the end of the day, and why it has so many pretenders. Thank you.